Welcome to the Inside Interviews podcast, where we try to produce an enlightening series of academic discussions where we take a deeper dive into a variety of unique topics connected to Shi'i studies, religious studies, Islamic studies. And if after this episode, you can check out our numerous other episodes. I think we have 30 plus episodes now up on our site and YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And today we are pleased to have Matthew Pierce, who has a PhD from Boston University, is an associate professor of religion at Centre College and director of Centre Global. He is the author of 12 Infallible Men, the Imams, and the Making of Shi'ism, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. He's the winner also of the Iran Book Year Award. Matthew Pierce has lived and studied in Egypt, Yemen, and Iran. He specialized in Islamic history, religion and sexuality, and sectarianism. Pierce has published his work in premier reference volumes such as the Princeton Encyclopedia of Islamic Political Thought and Encyclopedia of Islam, in edited book volumes such as Women, Leadership in Mosques, Challenge Changes in Contemporary Islamic Authority, and in academic journals such as the Journal of Shia Islamic Studies. He has 3 chapters accepted for publication in the upcoming book, Islam in 5 Minutes, published by Equinox in 2026. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Pierce. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
The Shia Research Institute is an institute of learning and thought and discussion and discourse on Shi'ism. Your work clearly, your 2 published monographs, are engaged at the very heart of what that means. So I really couldn't think of a more appropriate guest to have on, considering your published work on this subject. I always like to ask our guests, why Shi'ism? It seems to be this minority religion. It's not, numerically at least. How did you become interested in studying Shi'i Islam? And then obviously end up publishing two monographs in that field, or related field, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, thank you for this invitation. I'm really honored to be here having this conversation with you and really love the work that you all put out. I think the question of how you get into this kind of topic or any topic that you study is a actually a really important question to think about. And so my own journey into this area of studies, I'm quite aware, informed, so the approach that I've taken and some of the questions that I ask and and the way that I approach the topic in general. So I would actually go back even a little bit further here and just say that, I grew up in the United States in a pretty conservative Christian environment myself. And I think I grew up in a context where there was a lot of particular kinds of perceptions of Islam, mostly quite negative perceptions. And this was even my growing up. This is pre 9/11 days, but quite negative perceptions. And I think I was very influenced that as a young person, as a child, as a teenager. And and so I got interested, however, in the Middle East and studying Islam and learning about it, and had lived in Egypt for a while and Yemen for a while. And one of the things that I was really struck by in my early, just we're talking about, undergraduate level, initial learning about Islam at the most basic level, was I was really struck by just how rich the tradition was, how different it was than what I had grown up kind of hearing about Islam in a kind of popular imagination. Um, how misunderstood the Islamic tradition was generally by your average American, let's say. And that inspired my interest in going into to more scholarly academic pursuits of studying Islam in general. But it was then later I got an opportunity to study in Iran for several years. And again, this was before I was doing my graduate work, just before I started my PhD program. Was able to study in Iran for 3 years. And that was really my first encounter with Shia tradition, obviously specifically 12-verse Shia tradition. And I think one of the things that really struck me while living and studying in Iran was similarly just how misunderstood I realized the Shia tradition was. So I had been prior to that time, kind of approaching Islam from a mainly kind of Sunni focused, Sunni normative kind of viewpoint. And then I was coming into Iran and relearning some of the history of Islam and kind of ideas of approaches to Islam that were not necessarily I mean they were different in some ways, but it was the same in some ways. And I think I was just really struck by, wow, this I had read about Shi'ism in this kind of superficial way and with particular caricatures and sort of generalizations, and I became really intrigued with again the richness of this particular tradition within Islam. And so when I started my graduate studies eventually, I think I was always kind of constantly aware of how much your general descriptions of Islam tend to privilege kind of uh, the larger mainstream majority view, which is a majority Sunni view. And so I was always thinking about it forced me to think about the boundaries of the tradition and to think a lot about the boundaries of any religious tradition, whether it's within a tradition like Islam and Sunni and Shia boundaries, and then thinking about Sufism and all these kinds of categories, but also then boundaries between religious traditions. So religious studies, obviously, where we are thinking a lot about what really constitutes those boundaries. Shi'ism provides a really helpful place to constantly complicate how we understand religious tradition, the Islamic tradition. And so I've just found it a really rich place to focus my work.
Wow, 3 years you lived. That is, people go for 3 months, 6 months. From someone who's lived in the Middle East for on and off for a very long time, on and off, not, that's a while in Iran. Where were you studying in Iran for 3 years? That's
Yeah,
not many Americans can say they've studied in Iran for that long.
uh,
That's unique.
I was very fortunate. Yeah, some of the best years of my life. Our oldest daughter was actually born in
Nice.
Iran. We had a wonderful time there. So it was a particularly unique program. So as I said, I've came into my study of Islam from a Christian tradition. And at that point, we found out we were living in Yemen at the time, and found out about a religious exchange program
Okay.
that was organized through the Mennonite Central Committee in the North American side. And I'm not from a Mennonite background, but I had a lot of respect for the Mennonite tradition. And they had this religious exchange
Yes,
program
it's well known.
with an Imam Khomeini Institute
Yeah.
in Qom,
Yeah.
a very relatively conservative institution within Qom, obviously a particularly important site of religious learning within the Shia tradition. And the way this exchange was set up was very much geared around the idea was to have some students from North America go from a Christian background and just study Islam in Qom with professors there, and then they would send students from the Jose to a school in Canada, actually in Toronto, to study kind of Western philosophy and Christian theology. And it was just a student exchange program essentially, but it was really geared around exchange of religious ideas. And it was a rich time for me.
Oh yeah, I'm aware of this exchange. I had to be. I knew it was through Mossad, Imam Khomeini, and in those days, obviously, Aga Misbah was
Uh-huh.
around, right? Misbah
Yep.
Yazdi.
Yep.
And Sheikh Shomali obviously was at the
Yep.
center of that. Muhammad Shomali
Exactly.
is a dear friend, or haven't seen him in many years. I would say more like a mentor, you know.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
okay, yeah, well, it's
Yeah.
a small world. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So some of my early classes on one of
yeah,
my early classes on Irfan was with Professor Shomali. Yes.
yeah, Dr. Shomali, of
Yeah.
course. Okay, so so you've had quite a bit of exposure to the Shia source material then. I mean, to learning about it and the Hadith material and what it's about and the spiritual life. And so coming to your current book, although I would love to talk about your other book, but um 12
Sure.
Infallible Men, but uh well, I guess why don't you tell me how this one kind of followed up? Because the two books are always somehow connected, aren't they? I mean,
Yeah.
your second monograph, it's not completely different from the first one in some senses. So why don't you tell us how the first monograph kind of led to the intellectually to this second book, right? Which you
Yeah.
said
Yeah.
was published, worked on some years ago, but now has kind of seen the light of day, right? But
Right. Right.
we're always interested to learn the author's kind of how the author arrived at. Okay, so your first book, 12
Mhm.
Infallible Men, right, was about this monarchic for the genre and kind of what it means, and you're kind of looking at it through, you know, kind of understanding, kind of what this hagiography means within Shi'i tradition through a religious studies lens. And
Yeah.
now coming to this book, so kind of tell us about the transition, or kind of how you came to write about the life of Ja'far
Sure.
al-Sadiq now,
Yeah.
right? And
Absolutely.
kind of
Thank you.
where it fits into your
Mhm.
intellectual or kind of scholastic development. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, uh, when I was in graduate school, I took a course that was on kind of gender and religious studies, and we read a book. I mentioned this in the preface of my
Mhm.
first book. We read a book by Elizabeth Castelli on martyrdom and memory that was looking at early Christian stories of Christian saints or
Okay.
Christian
Yeah,
holy
yeah,
men,
yeah.
and how those stories in the second and third and fourth centuries in the Christian tradition, how those stories of those holy men in the Christian tradition really shaped uh, the the way Christianity and Christian experience and Christian ideas evolved entirely. And it's a great book. And but when I was reading it, I had been previously living in Iran and been kind
Mhm.
of immersed in all these stories of the Imams and I just kept thinking about the way that the stories of the Imams have been so formative for shaping Shia tradition and Shia identity, and so that was really the launch point of what, of course, started as a dissertation, and then that eventually came that my first book, and there in that first book, it is, as you mentioned, looking at the Manaqib literature and really trying to look at how this what I argue is a particular kind of genre of Shia literature, these kind of collective biographies of the 12 Imams, how that literature developed and what the early examples of it were. And so I select these five early examples of that literature and then try to do deep dive into those, looking at where some of the themes and motifs and common features of this genre of literature that was developing, where that came from, what some of the concerns were, and what some of the motivations were for how those stories were crafted. And and in that book, of course, I'm quick to note that I'm not in that book trying to actually tell the history of the lives of any of the imams. The book is truly not about the imams. It's about the later stories about the imams. And but in writing that book, uh, and trying to find material written about the Imams, it was again, I was reminded freshly just how little, in English at least, particularly, how little literature is written about the Imams. And you've got, a little smattering of things about Imam Ali, about Imam Hussein. But beyond that, there's very little in English written, certainly that's accessible to general audiences, if someone wanted to know about these figures. And so that was where I started thinking, well, what if I tried to, what would it look like today to try to tell the story of someone like Ja'far al-Sadiq? And so this became the focus of this recent book. And of course, as we will probably get into more, it's not easy to really to tell the story of these figures because there's so many complications with the source material and the history and the legacy and so I'm not sure that at the end of the day, I'm not sure the book is still even as much about Ja'far al-Sadiq as it is about sort of the context around him and maybe some of the things that are said about him, because it becomes really hard to say with much confidence in my reading who this historical person was. And yet, I think trying to introduce his name and his legacy to general American audiences a bit more is something that I found worthwhile to spend some time on.
Yeah, I mean, the book is accessible. It's short. It's readable. Like this is something I could probably give to a high school student, an upper level high school student, or an undergraduate. And that's what I like about it. It's not inundated with technical material like my monograph, which is just coming out, is not that, right? It's this thick, thing with the snods and all kinds of stuff in it, fully loaded, all the sprinkles on it, which is kind of like what some of our first books are, right?
Yeah.
But this is not that. This is something that's really, really, anyone can really read it. I mean, I'm not saying nobody can read my book, but this is this is different, and that's
That's
what
what I
I
was
like about
trying for. I was
it.
trying for. It's
Right.
certainly my first
It's an
book.
easy read. It's not a hard read. It's you get the points across. It's obviously academic, but it's not filled with jargon on
Yeah.
every other
Yeah.
page, like German. Some of these books shift from German to Latin to Arabic back to German, Greek, no
Yeah.
translation sometimes, right?
Right.
But
Right.
no, I think you achieved that, at least in opening the door to Jafar Sadiq. And one of the things that I liked about the book is that you did include some quotations from him, or at least those
Mhm.
things that are attributed to him.
Sure.
Um, it, I know you wrote it a long time ago, but do you remember any particular saying of his that maybe stood out to you, or something that was attributed to him that like, wow, that's really interesting. This is worth including in my book, you know?
Yeah. And yes, just I think teaching where I currently teach at Center College, it's a 4-year undergraduate liberal arts college where none of the students come in with a lot of background in Islamic studies. I found out right away that trying to use my first book, it was never going to be readable to any of my students.
Yeah, it's a deep book. Yeah.
And so yeah, I was really thinking a lot about my students when I wrote this book on Ja'far al-Sadiq and thinking about, like you said, just high school students or introduction college students and
Mhm.
being able to just introduce some basic things um and of course to your question, there's so much there's just so much inspirational material ascribed to Ja'far al-Sadiq, and a lot that you could choose from. And I tried to include a number of things, both in the kind of throughout the chapters and then also at the end of the chapters, uh, regarding just some quotes that are attributed to him. Um, I think, and we might go into this in more depth later, but I think if you just asked maybe any particular quotes that stood out to me,
Yeah,
uh,
anything. Yeah.
I think one of the things that did really stand out to me, has impressed me, been impressed upon me, I think, from reading the material. is especially Ja'far al-Sadiq's kind of commentaries and approaches to the Quran itself,
Okay.
right? And um, the way in which he seems to, from a lot of the material ascribed to him, seems to be, and again, this is just my interpretation here of some of the writings, that be a little less interested in trying to provide the sort of dogmatic one solution to what this particular Quranic passage means and how it should be interpreted, but rather has this way of trying to kind of open up the Quran for how it would be speaking to people individually, right? This kind of more, again, what we might refer to as a kind of mysticism or
Mhm.
esoteric interpretations, but just a kind of more open kind of engagement with the divine word. And um, I think there's a quote that I picked out here that's in the collection attributed to Abdurrahman Salami, that where Ja'far al-Sadiq says about in explicating one of the Quranic passages, he says the truth has made the hearts of his friends meadows of his intimacy. He's planted in them trees of knowledge whose roots are firmly fixed in their inmost selves and whose branches stand in the divine presence in the assembly of witnessing. They reap the fruits of intimacy at every instant. Everyone harvests from it a type in keeping with the scope of his efforts and according to the manifestations of knowledge. And I think that like that kind of way of talking about the Quran, where what you may understand from it is going to be determined by what you bring to it on a personal level.
Mhm.
Um, I found it really just a profound and inspirational, and I think that's one of the things that I have one of the parts of the teachings attributed to Ja'far al-Sadiq that has been most powerful to me on a personal level.
His spiritual teachings, right? Just
Yeah.
note out, and you talk about that like in the book quite a bit, right? His profound humility, like all
Mhm.
these narrations, right? I mean, there's just so much, as you said. I mean, it's just um and I if I'm not correct, maybe and please correct me if or chime in here, obviously, which is that one of the things that perhaps we could say, again, we're looking at this as a historian of religion, not as necessarily a 12 or Shia studying this or Sunnis. How a historian of religion would view this, within the kind of Western academic context. Um, One of the things perhaps that we can say is nearly universal in how all these different groups have approached him is what he has left behind in terms of these very profound, spiritual, insightful sayings, right?
Yeah.
Would you kind of say
Yeah.
that's something that the various groups can somewhat agree on?
Yes, that seems to be certainly a kind of commonality
A
across a thread.
commonality, right?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
gives us maybe a degree of, I think you quote Bowring, right, to this effect, right? That
Mhm.
Gerhard Bowring, right, the famous Yale professor, that we could maybe say that some of this perhaps may have very well originated from him, at least these ideas or some of these concepts, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I did struggle a lot, and I have to say that I still have a lot of skepticism about how much of the material can be safely attributed to the historical
Yeah,
person. But I did also walk away feeling like there was such a commonality of that spirituality motif that wasn't even clearly marshaled for any particular sectarian or
yeah,
identity purpose. Sometimes when some of these quotes are put towards a purpose, it may have been historically accurate, but
yeah,
the fact that it's being used and deployed in this particular way at least raises some questions about whether it's authentic. But often these quotes were not even for any particular purpose, just they just seem to be this common thread. And I do think this was likely one of to me in my reading, I think this is probably the most likely core of the historical Ja'far al-Sadiq's teachings.
Yeah, I like that that the comment that you made, or that remark. And you on page 48, chapter 2, a teacher of teachers, you begin by quoting Sheikh al-Mufid, right? The Irshad, which is the the famous Shiite book of biographies of the Imams, right? From Imam Ali to the 12th Imam. And I'll read it aloud here so I can read it. But I just found this interesting. There's so much to unpack. Ja'far al-Sadiq was the most renowned man of the highest rank, revered more than any other within the larger community, as well as among the elite. People passed on knowledge from him wherever they traveled, until he was known throughout the lands. And religious scholars have cited his authority on matters more than anyone else from among the Ahlul Bayt. That's a pretty profound statement. That and you chose to include it here, right? A teacher of teachers. Would you say this is something that could be shared by both Shias and Sunnis? Or how would you interpret this statement? Well, obviously you do. You write a whole chapter after quoting that, but that
Yeah,
statement
yeah,
of Mufid. So he's known all over. He's this really
yeah.
famous transmitter of hadith.
Hmm.
Uh, al-a'lam fi zamanihi,
Hmm.
the most learned, and then obviously the patriarch of Ahlul Bayt.
Yeah,
How
yeah. You know,
how much of this was accepted, would you say, outside of a Shia milieu?
yeah, yeah. I think that the most basic portions of that he was regarded in his time as one of the great teachers of his day, and clearly that people came to him and received teachings and spread those teachings in other areas on his authority. I don't know that there can be really much doubt that was the case, and that he was highly revered. Again, just almost across the spectrum. It's really actually hard to find someone who uh, didn't think highly of him. Now, again, as I mentioned in the book, I think there develops, because of the later Sunni Shia kinds of identity, traditions and markers and divides, and uh, in all fronts. I think there comes to be a hesitancy in broader Sunni traditions of quoting Ja'far al-Sadiq, and understandably so, right? He becomes this highly revered figure in later Shia traditions for sure. He's Lots of things are attributed to him that, again, uh, are hard to verify, and he becomes the representative of a lot of the teachings within Shia traditions, or kind of a not representative as much as a sort of symbol for a lot of the teachings in the Shia tradition. And so, of course, it's natural that many in the Sunni tradition just don't focus on his teachings so much, because it was complicated in these kinds of sectarian debates, context. But again, in going back, the worst thing that you find is just people being unsure of what was really said, and so they just kind of skip over him out of that reason. But nobody really has anything bad to say about him. He was
Yeah.
very,
Okay.
very well regarded. Now, I would also be quick to add, though, with Sheikh Mufid's comments here, that, I mean, he's writing again in the manaqib
Genre.
form of writing. He's clearly being hyperbolic to some extent, or certainly purposely, elevating Ja'far al-Sadiq here, as he does each of the Imams in this book. So it is also conforming to a pattern for Mufid. But at the same time, I think that that statement of the widely regarded nature of Ja'far al-Sadiq is really it's one of the things that it's hard to dispute
Yeah.
about the historical figure.
So let's go to Medina now.
Hmm.
Abbasid revolution. There's murmurings of well, not yet, but the Umayyads are in trouble towards the latter part of uh of the Imam's life.
Hmm.
Um, what was Medina like at that time? Kind of give us, you do discuss it in the book, but kind of set the stage of what was Medina looking like, both intellectually and politically,
Hmm.
in light of
Hmm.
what was going on around Medina at that
Yeah.
time, towards the latter, especially towards the latter life of 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 the Imam or
Yeah.
Sadiq.
Yeah. Um, and I think this is again his relationship to what was going on in his day. I think is one of for me, one of the most interesting parts of all of this, and it's again hard to say a lot confidently, except that it seems pretty clear to me that he was very intentional about not getting involved in a lot of the movements, the revolutionary movements,
Mhm.
the the anti-Umayyad movements, I don't know if it's would be accurate to say he's a political quietist or anything like, but he certainly did not attempt to lead any of those movements, and uh, very it's clear that he had opportunities, and if he wanted to have been the figurehead or a leader of one of those movements, he would have had a following to do that, and so Medina there in this moment is such an interesting period of history. It's of course it's in Ja'far al-Sadiq's childhood, he's growing up after the kind of Marwanid
Yeah.
Umayyad lineage. In his early childhood, he would have been in a context where the Umayyad have spread, like the conquests have been just immense from, Spain to China kind of thing. And
And there,
so
I
he's
guess there's
aware of
also a lot
that.
of wealth now coming
A
in.
lot of wealth, a lot of wealth coming through, people from all over the world coming through, obviously, making pilgrimage, but typically staying a while in Medina to learn and to hear stories of the Prophet, to learn the tradition, and again, it seems clear that Ja'far al-Sadiq was one of the most revered figures in that context. So it's it's remarkable to think about what influence he had to have played that sometimes just wouldn't even be clear in the history books, because this was a pivotal historical space where people from across the empire were now coming and learning about Islam and learning about the tradition. And he would have been a key person people would have been going to hear some of these stories. Um, so it's certainly a vibrant time. There was, I believe it was in his childhood that the new mosque in Medina was built by the Umayyads. That was a larger structure, a stone structure, had been a wooden structure prior to that. So it was this investment in his young life and investment in the structures that would facilitate public teaching and conversation and piety and so forth. And so um, it's a really remarkable context for him to be a part of, but it also was, as we know, of course, a contentious place. It was a place that was often at odds with the Umayyads in various ways, and a place that the Umayyads had a difficult time keeping control of. It had some autonomy and had a kind of relative, I think it seems like a relative openness to exchange of ideas that is quite remarkable. I think there was a lot more, again, my own reading of the history of that moment. I think there was a lot more openness and unsettledness to some questions that later on would become kind of fixed standard interpretations in both Sunni and Shia traditions that were quite open at the time. And I think there was a lot of conversations that he would have been a part of there that were exciting.
Yeah, because of course it was the time of the development of Islamic law, theology. There's so many vital questions which would shape later Muslim identity in extraordinary ways that were, the seeds of which were around the time of Imam al-Baqir and
Hmm.
Sadiq, right? Predestination, the use
Hmm.
of opinion and reason and deriving, Islamic law, all of these things. And he was, as your book says, at the nexus of Islam. He really was at the
Yeah.
nexus of
Yeah.
these very important conversations. And with keeping that in mind, what was his relationship like with other major figures who are now we would find them in an encyclopedia next to his name?
Hmm. Um, honestly,
And
that's
did he
where
have
it's,
disagreements with people as well?
yeah. I think, I mean, I mentioned a few of those figures here and there
Yeah.
and try to make a few guesses, but honestly, that is where it starts to get more questionable for me because once you start talking about those figures, whether they're, you know, figures that are famous within Sunni legal traditions or
Yeah.
figures who are famous in later Shia traditions, there becomes some uncertainty about why these stories are being told later on and what it's doing for those figures, what it's doing for the later traditions, and um, so I do start to get a little skeptical, or not skeptical as much as just cautious about what would say is reflecting a historical person versus uh, the identities and groups that are later centered around those individuals. But that being said, again, I do think I mean, Malik bin Nass quotes Ja'far al-Sadiq in his Muwatta in his legal collection and seems to have no hesitancy about doing so. Abu Hanifa seems to have taken some studies with Ja'far al-Sadiq. Um, and of course, there's more famous Shia traditional figures that again, he was a key figure, a key teacher at the time. Um, but it's hard to parse out, I
Mhm.
think, what the real relationship was between the historical Ja'far al-Sadiq and these figures. Yeah, I
So
just
perhaps could we then view it kind of stepping out and saying, okay, as per Sunni and Shi'i memory, which are two
mm,
very different memories of what
mm,
recorded,
yeah.
um, this is really perhaps where some differences start to appear very much so.
Hmm.
Like, for example,
Hmm.
in the Shia tradition, his relationship with Abu Hanifa began well and then soured because أول من قاس إبليس and all of that, right? All of these traditions are, many of
Yeah.
them go back to him, to 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 the Imam.
Hmm.
At least in Shi'i tradition, it is, right? The
Hmm.
first one who performed, analogy was Iblis. Um,
Hmm.
and that concept becomes very much identified with Abu Hanifa, so
Hmm.
the use of
Right.
qiyas, right?
Right.
And perhaps would I be correct in saying from a Sunni standpoint, when viewing the same person, they would say, no, that's not the case at all. They had a very good relationship. He never repudiated him. He was a student for a time. Maybe they had some differences. It's not like this. So this is where these memories are now in stark opposition, maybe, to one
Mhm,
another.
mhm.
Would you say that's
Yeah, no, I think it is where you start to get those differences, at least in how the stories are told. And
yeah,
and again, what you really see mm, overall is that in the broader Shia tradition, particularly 12er Shia traditions, Ja'far al-Sadiq, there's a sort of immense expansion of uh, the number of traditions and stories that are told about Ja'far al-Sadiq, whereas in the Sunni tradition, uh, it's just kind of almost a dwindling of telling of stories, and it's not so much that the Sunni tradition takes the time that Sunni teachers took the time to argue against some of these ideas, some of the claims of about Ja'far al-Sadiq, as much as they just kind of stopped talking about him. And and again, that's not to say that he wasn't revered. Any of these, like the scholars, when they're asked or what where it comes up, they say he was great. Um, but then they kind of tend to not take the time to delve into it. And again, it was kind of a fraught topic because of the way things developed later on. And at least that's my reading of things. And I would say it's important for maybe viewers or anyone reading about this to keep in mind that at least I make the argument, I make this argument in my other book as well, that we we really have to be careful to acknowledge that I don't think there's anything that we can call Sunni and Shia identity in the time of Ja'far al-Sadiq, right? We know that obviously there is a term Shi'a. There were the Shi'at Ali. There were partisans of Ali. There was, that was a tradition of regarding Ali and the family of the Prophet Muhammad, and I think there was something that we could identify as a tradition that later becomes what gets called Shi'ism or 12er Shi'ism, but I think one of the things I try to constantly keep in mind when reading some of the stories about Ja'far al-Sadiq is just that I think a lot of the categories that were so important later on and the divisions that become prominent later on got read onto his life so frequently, and that became a filter for how people interpreted him. And I was trying to not let that filter influence the reading too much. But it's impossible ultimately to see the history and teachings attributed to him completely absent from that filter because it's always there. It's all the sources we have are influenced by it. Uh, but yes, it does start to become prominent here in some of these teachings.
and one of those, probably, I guess, one of those central um discussions is Walaya. It's
Mm,
everywhere, isn't it? It
mhm,
becomes
mm,
synonymous
mhm.
with wilayatuna wama nudiya bi shay'in, right? And nothing is emphasized like wilaya. Actually, I think that's from al-Bakr. But the point is that these sorts of traditions
Mhm.
are become almost synonymous with Ja'far al-Sadiq, and the sixth Imam, at least for Shi'is, becomes synonymous, as you mentioned, with the institutionalization. Not that it wasn't earlier for Shiites, as per Shiite memory, but especially at the time of the sixth Imam. I mean, in putting this down, this nass, this concept of divine
Yeah.
election,
Mhm.
and kind of bringing that system together, it almost becomes very hard to pull him out of it because, as you mentioned very well, to remove him from that equation would essentially, I mean, Shiism will collapse.
Yeah.
Its theological edifice as it was formed, let's say, at a later time, but believed to have originated from him.
Hmm. Hmm.
He's that vital to them.
Yeah, no, he is. I mean, obviously, it is, as I think you mentioned, I mean, alluded, it's he and his father,
Yeah.
he's following in this tradition of his father and grandfather of these teachings, that I think, Imam Bakr starts developing. Ja'far al-Sadiq seems to develop further, and really put this walaya and nass, and as kind of core concepts that he's teaching around, that of course are the bedrock of later Shia tradition. But I also think I think there is maybe some ways of reading some of his statements about these without, what I've tried to do is read them not through the lens of later 12 Shia interpretations, but what did Walaya do and mean within this moment?
So,
And it really does seem to speak to, I think, the focus that he had on Walaya seems to speak to the turbulence of his period, right? Trying to kind of, I think that it was providing some continuity and stability to the tradition in a moment of a lot of uncertainty, not just political uncertainty, but religious uncertainty and social uncertainty, and trying to provide some guidance for his followers on how to kind of orient themselves. And of course, one of the great ironies, and to me, I know this wouldn't be, not everyone would say it this way, but almost kind of tragedies of his life was that he seems to have tried put so much energy in trying to put some continuity and stability uh to to the teachings that he's inherited through his father and grandfather, um and yet with the death of Isma'il and the uncertainty of the succession following him, uh I think it was a really, there's an irony here that there's a division within the Shia tradition following Ja'far al-Sadiq, who was one who was putting such great effort to try to create continuity, I think, in the tradition. Um, but the incidents, the circumstances of his life and the death of his son, towards the end of his life, made it very hard, to provide that continuity. But of course, these ideas did live on and did provide a kind of intellectual continuity to some degree.
yeah, I mean, of course, and it's a kind of spiritual doctrinal mentorship, right?
Hmm.
Which
Hmm.
elevates the teacher well beyond being a normal teacher. He
Hmm.
becomes this kind of spiritual paragon whose obedience or take is almost prophet-like in some sense. Right? The teacher or the muallim or imam takes on this position as he would in Sufism as well, very much
Right,
so.
right.
And that's why Walaya is so ubiquitous in both traditions, right? The Shi'i and Sufi, traditions, or Shi'i Sufism, whatever you want to call it, right? I mean,
Hmm.
some
Hmm.
say the two are not distinguishable later on, but
Hmm. Hmm.
that's a
Hmm.
different discussion altogether, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it's yeah, it's fascinating. I think this whole discussion of early Islam and what we know and what we don't know,
Hmm.
and it's just so interesting. I think it also tells us, how later texts attempt to, to give shape to the past, right? Naturally. Again, kind of trying to look at this, I mean, from a different angle. When we look at the sheer amount of material, right? So, for example, if we look at the scholarship of someone like Ethan Colbert, right, who spent better part of his life on this subject of early Shi'ism, early Shi'i texts, or Hossein Modarresi, for example, right?
Yeah.
Um, the plethora of material that goes back to Jafar Sadiq, whether it be these 400 usul, which is, 400 is just a number. This is something that I study extensively, right? And I talk about it in my book with regards to the Dua and Ziyarat literature, that there was an existence of early notebook material. Uh,
Hmm.
from the time of the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth Imam, like that period, right? Those
Yep.
couple of centuries. And just the number of companions and texts and all of this kind of circulating around the sixth Imam, or for the sixth
Hmm.
Imam for the Shias, and the Jafar Sadiq just for for non-Shias, let's say. Um, what are some of your high level thoughts on this, and just kind of taking stock of the of Kohlberg scholarship, Decade scholarship, Mudarrisi scholarship on this subject as well, others as well. I've tried to kind of look at that from the Dua and Ziyarat perspective, because there's just so much that goes back to him through
Yep.
different chains, through different means, through different notebooks, right? Looking at Najashi and Kishi
Hmm.
and Ibn Khulaway and here and there, and through so many different means, right?
Yeah.
Um, what does it tell us about? Again, we're not saying there's, we know for certain all this is from him, but uh, I don't know. What are your thoughts, kind of high level thoughts of this? Is there equivalent amount of material found in other traditions that are ascribed to him, whether it be in political,
There's not. I mean, there's
theological,
certainly,
devotional material, like tons of devotional material, right?
yeah.
Even if we were to say 75 or 50% or 40% of it may have been, or that, you know, um, yeah. So I guess my point is kind of like, what do you think of that, in light of all your research on early Shi'ism,
Right.
in that. And obviously these texts are not extant anymore, but Decade makes use of them. Maria
Yep.
Decade does make
Yep.
use of some of this
Yep.
usul material in her book.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
You know, it, it's a great point and question, and frankly, I think some of it in working on this book, it's overwhelming. I mean, it's
Yeah,
so much
so
material.
much.
It's so much material. The Twelver tradition, particularly, expounded and recorded so much of this material that, and it's not even in the other Shia traditions like the Ismaili traditions
Mhm.
that have plenty of material, but it's not nearly the volume that's recorded in the Twelver tradition, and ascribed to him in the Twelver tradition. And then certainly, as we mentioned, in most mainstream Sunni traditions, uh, you know, he's regarded, but that they don't tend to expound a lot of traditions from him. And even I found interestingly, despite the fact that nearly every Sufi tariqa has a silsila that goes
Yeah,
through Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he's uh, practically universally regarded as an important teacher within the early mystical traditions. Even there, it just doesn't have quite the same level of like the volume that you find in the 12 tradition of stories and narrations attributed to him. It doesn't compare, and I think it it's hard to understand. It's hard to make sense of with some confidence. And I remember one of the, I think it was Kareem Douglas Crowe,
oh
who
yeah,
ended an article about
great
him
story.
about Jafar Sadiq, and referred to this. I think he called it an aura of elusiveness that surrounds Ja'far al-Sadiq. And it seemed like the more you read, at least I found, the more that I tried to kind of tease out, uh, find this historical figure, the more elusive he seemed to be. And it's one of the reasons that ultimately what started as kind of personally conceptualized as a biography of Ja'far al-Sadiq didn't really end up being a biography of Ja'far al-Sadiq. It's kind of talking around him in various ways
Yeah,
that I hope is again, I think it's useful for audiences who I think there's a lot of audiences who know some of the early names of early Islamic history, but as soon as you get past the first generation around Muhammad and the early founding of Islam, there's a lack of knowledge of the context of this kind of 8th century Medina and the teachings and the how some of these ideas were evolving and key people like Ja'far al-Sadiq who are relatively unknown often. So I hope to kind of like provide some general information, but this book is going to be very unsatisfying for scholars like yourself who are immersed in all these narrations. And I realized quickly that I was not going to be equipped or willing to spend the time that it would take to
Yeah.
try to tease out from all of these narrations where you would put your confidence as reliable traditions over others. And they seem to be not even, to me, they did not seem to be clearly located in some textual traditions over others. I think there's a kind of sprinkling of stories that were likely authentic amidst a lot of stories that were, I don't mean like malicious, like intentionally fabricated as much as just a little bit blended with imagination and community needs and filtered through historical memory
Yeah.
more than is really necessarily accurate. So it just becomes. I hope that a better scholar can come along and really tease some of this out because it's overwhelming, really.
It is like, and it's just, but I think it also demonstrates the paucity of quality material on the Imams. By
Yeah,
quality material, I mean engaging, material that engages with important scholarly questions. That's out there. There's
yeah,
just simply so little material on the Shi'i Imams.
yeah,
And uh and it's, yeah, it's virtually untapped, really.
yeah,
I mean, there's
yeah.
just so many, like, and one of the things, again, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, one of the things that I think your book does well, it doesn't necessarily answer it. You yourself say, I'm not attempting to answer questions here. I'm attempting to kind of open the door to bringing awareness about how important
Mhm.
this figure is.
Right.
It can take us down so many different roads. So, for example, what was his relationship with the Umayyads? Like there's like,
Hmm.
again, in the Shi'i tradition, there's just so much about that, right? The whole idea of him
Hmm.
spending time at court. What does that mean, right? There's
Hmm.
narrations in the Kafi, right, where he just sort of refers to the Abbasids as ha'ula'i al-qawm,
Yeah.
right? These people, right?
Yeah.
Don't even use the word Abbasid, right? And then in the
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Hashia of the manuscript, it's Ain Ba Sin or Ain Ba,
Mm.
right?
Hmm. Yeah.
What did that tell us? Like what did that transition look like? I mean, I don't know if there's much written on that, right? So,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
you allude to it that there is a complex relationship here, right? During this transitional period. And I think, again, I think you did that well. And I think that this is a book that could be read by yeah, general reader and believers alike, right? Shia or Sunni would
Yeah.
benefit from it, right? Because you straddle both traditions, right? Which is not easy to do.
Yeah. Right. Right. But that's what I was hoping to. I do really believe he's a historical figure that has significance for just in the history of religious ideas in
Yeah,
general,
in general.
and certainly for all Muslim traditions, has significance. And so I did try to, while I'm certainly aware that I'm using most of the material out there is through Shia traditions, tried to really be cognizant of that, mindful of it, careful, and try to just start talking about this figure. In ways that can be helpful to early students, but also Muslims from various backgrounds.
I wanted to end on a more universal note, shall we say. You eloquently describe him in the following way. I don't remember what page, but I've written it down here. Generosity, self-sacrifice, and compassion were virtues that he modeled, right? And again, coming back to him being this universal figure of piety, of Muslim piety. Um, would you like I guess is there an example from his life or something that you'd like to share with us, that because I mean that's you it's written quite beautiful, it's written quite well there, it's a nice description, but is there sometimes for the for the listener, like what was it about him that was so generous and humble and pious, and
Mhm.
what may have that look like,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Um,
how may have it been imagined, shall we say?
right. It is it's hard to pin down on specific things, any one specific thing, but um I think that statement is really summarizing some of the general impressions that I walked away from after spending a bit of time on these traditions. And I think that again, kind of going back to something I was saying earlier, I think he um it seems to me that he was reacting to or aware of or sort of shaped by the turbulence of his time. Um, a lot of people at the time claiming new ideas, new philosophies, new political approaches, new revolutions, um, and it seemed like there was this constant or at least frequent tendency to want to bring people back to these, core ethical teachings, and that there was a kind of centering of an insistence on centering piety on these very core ethical values of how we interact with each other, and rather than letting it rather than chasing these ideas of framing
Mhm.
his religion around a particular philosophy or a particular political paradigm. It was really these kind of core ethical values that he kept pulling people back to. And I think that was what was really kind of stood out to me with in kind of going across all of these stories.
It's almost like these humanist spiritual principles, right? That
Yeah,
seem to be coming up again and again, right? This notion of
yeah,
simplicity, charity,
right,
prayer, these things that, could be universal within the Islamic tradition, really, right?
right, right. Absolutely.
While all these other people are trying to do these new things in political movements and revolutions and rebellions and all of these these other things. And I guess to kind of wrap up, he's for that reason, and for other reasons, has left an extraordinary legacy
Absolutely. Yeah,
on
very much
Islam,
so.
right?
Yeah,
And I also like how you mentioned he's a figure worthy of being like of being studied not only by Muslims, but just in general in the history of religions.
yeah, absolutely.
And so yeah, I think this was a great conversation. And we hope maybe we can have we can continue this conversation in the future.
Thank
We
you. I really
yeah,
appreciate your time.
really appreciate you coming on. We thank our viewers for joining us, listening this far. If you really like our content, maybe think about contributing to the Institute to help drive more quality content. And we hope you'll join. I mean, our viewers will join us in our future episodes. Thank you again, Dr. Pierce, for joining
All right.
us.
Thank you. All right.